Hello, we're just going to continue with Unit 5, which is graphing linear equations and some other equations. So there'll be a series of videos that I'd like you to watch, and that will help complement the questions that you have on My Math Lab. So to begin with, we're just going to do a real quick review from what we did the last time we were together before the college closed down on graphs of linear equations based on tables. So these are our goals. When I look to create the exam, these are the things that I'm going to be looking at. Take a minute right now to write down these topics in your notes, and then write a short or a brief explanation of each one of those. So as a quick review, we're going to solve some equations. Looking at the first equation, get my pen ready here. So looking at the first equation, remember we think in terms of undo steps. Remember that we think in terms of gathering our numbers together, gathering our variables together. Okay, so my undo steps on the first one. If this first one says minus 9, I'm going to add 9 to both sides. Negative 13 plus 9 gives me negative 4. Looking at the second one, notice it's 14 times k, which means I have to divide both sides by 14, which means k is equal to negative 9. This next one here really is saying negative 5 equals a divided by 18. So if I'm going to do an undo step, I have to move that divide 18. And I'm going to do that by multiplying by 18. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 18. And that gives me negative 90 equals a. So stop the video right now, look over those, and try those on your own. The next set of equations that we are going to review are looking at multiple steps. So for example, on this one, I have the 9x, so I'll have to move the 9. I have the minus 7, and I'll have to move that. I'm combining my numbers together, so I'll be adding 7 to both sides. And I get 9x equals 0, because that moves that. And negative 7 plus 7 is 0. I can stop now, or I can just continue and say, well, if I divide both sides by 9, dividing because it's 9 times x, I will get 0, so x is 0. So again, stop the video right now and try the 2n plus 10 equals negative 2. So I'm going to try the next one myself. And again, I'm going to combine the 10 and the negative 2, so I'm going to subtract 10 from both sides. That moves that 10, and I get 2n equals negative 12. Notice that the 2 is multiplied to the n, so therefore to undo that 2, I have to divide, and I get n is equal to negative 6. Again, stop the video, look over that problem, and make sure it makes sense. We're going to move on to the next problem. Why don't you stop the video, see if you can solve that problem, and then let's check our answers together. So in this case, I want to combine my m's together, which would be 42.35 and 5.34. And I want to combine my constants together, which is the 12.67 and the 26.58. I'm going to combine my constants together first by moving this 12.67 from the left side to the right side. And remember, when we combine like terms, I can only combine numbers with numbers and m's with m's. So I have 42.35 m equals 5.34 m, taking 26.58 and subtracting 12.67. I get 13.91. So all my numbers are together. Next step I need to do is I need to move my m's together. Notice that 5.34 is a positive, so I need to move it by making it a negative. again, that moves that completely out of there. And when I combine like terms, I am combining the coefficients. So I'm technically taking 42.35 and I'm subtracting 5.34. I get 37.01 m equals 13.91. And my last step here is to go ahead and divide out that 37.01 because it's attached to the m by multiplication. And when I do that, I get 0.36 as I round it. So that's the idea that we are going to use when we are talking about graphing equations, because we're going to be given an equation and we have to solve this equation so that we can have points. This first one, stop the video right now, take a minute to read the question. So you'll notice by reading the question that you have P equals 4 plus 2m, where P is the price and m are the miles. So when I set this up, notice that my points are as m, comma, p. Okay, so I'm going to plug in various m values and use the equation to find the p. Typically, I plug in a 0. In this case, because miles cannot be negative, I am only going to stay with positive m's. So I might use a 2. And I might use let's use a 1. So I'm going to plug those into my original equation. And my original equation is 4 plus 2m. So when I plug in 0 for m, I get p is 4. So my point now is 0, comma 4. I'm going to go ahead and use the same equation because I am trying to graph this equation. And instead of 0, I am now going to the next line where I'm going to plug in 2 for m. And I get p is 8. So the point I'm going to graph is going to be 2, comma 8. And then the last one, let's do that in a different color just so you can see them separately. Using the same equation, now I'm going to plug in 1 for m, and I solve for p, and that's a 6. And so my last point there is going to be 1, comma 6. And I'm using these points to create the graph or the line that shows all of the relationships between whatever mileage I put in and the price that comes out. So my next step is to go ahead and graph each of these points. Why don't you stop the video and see if you can graph the points as a review. So my point is 0, comma 4, so my x value, or excuse me, my horizontal is 0, but I go up 4. It's 2, 8, and I see that I ran out of a little bit of room, so I'm just going to have to make that as 2, 8. And my last one is 1, 6. And I make those points so that I can see them, and then I attach them with a line, and the line, again, tells me all of the possible combinations for this situation. So if I wanted to know when I travel half a mile, what the price would be. If I want to travel 5 miles, I can go up to the equation. So we're going to do the same thing. This is a bit of a review from last week. Again, stop the video, see what you can remember, go back to your notes, or just follow along with me. So I'm trying to graph this linear equation, and I need to use 3 points minimum to graph that line. And I'm going to create a table, and my table is going to be my x value, my y value, and then my points. And I'm going to pick 3 values. I can pick more than that, but I don't want to pick any less. And I am going to pick 3 x's to place in there. I usually like to pick positive, I like to pick negative, and I like to pick 0 if it works. So I'm going to start with 0. I'm going to pick a negative number, and I might go with -2. and I'm going to pick a positive number, and I can pick any positive number. I try to keep it pretty small so it's easy to graph. So maybe I'm going to pick a 1. Just as I did on the last screen, I am going to plug those into my equation, find the corresponding y values so I can create my point. So the first one, I'm plugging in a 0. So my y value is 1, and my point is 0, 1. The next one, I'm plugging in a -2, and notice order doesn't matter. And I get a -3. So my next point I'm going to graph is -2, -3. And my last one I am going to look at is 1. So my point is -1, which makes it 1, -1. And I'm now going to go over to my graph, my coordinate plane, and I am going to graph those. So again, stop the video, try graphing those. So I'm going to graph 0, 1. -2 is the x, -3 is the y. And I'm going to graph 1, -1. And one of the things I notice is that it didn't graph correctly. So I have to ask myself, where did I make my mistake? And one of the things I notice again is it's not a straight line, which means I made a mistake. So the first thing I do is I check, did I graph my points right? And I did. Then my second thing I check is, are my values all right? And this is my mistake. So it should be y equals -2 times -2 plus 1. And when I put that in my calculator, I don't get -3, I get 5. So this value should be 5, which means this point should be -2, 5. Now that looks a lot better. I'm going to graph those so that they connect as a line. I'm going to do the same thing on this one. Please create your table, use some negative, use a positive, maybe use 0, but create your table. So I went ahead and I just picked 3 points. I always try to pick 0, and then I try to pick a negative number and a positive number. Unfortunately, my numbers came out as decimals or fractions, but that's okay. I can still try to graph those. I solved each one of those for the corresponding y, created my points, and then graphed my line. How did you do? Even if you picked different x values, we should have the same graph. Here again, we are going to have another opportunity to create a table and graph the points. So let's go ahead and do that. Pick 3 points, create your table, find the corresponding y values, and then graph it. So here I went ahead and worked out my questions. Again, I picked 3 random x's. I like to pick 0 because it's an easy one to put into my equation. I always try to pick a negative number, so like a -1, -2, nothing too big. And I always try to pick a positive number, like 1, 2, 3. I plug it into my equation, and then I solve. I just use all my undo steps. So I'm going to subtract, and then go ahead and divide by the coefficient of y. I've created my points. For my points, I graph them. And remember, we could have different points because you might have chosen different x's. However, if you chose the same x values I did, we should have the same y values. Our graphs should look the same. So this is a situation where our graph is, our coefficient of x is a fraction of 2/5. And if you remember last time we talked in class, we said that when we have a fraction, we like to pick x values that are multiples of the denominator. So I'm going to change a couple of these numbers because I notice, for example, 10 is a multiple of the denominator, because multiples means like skip counting 5, 10, 15, 20. but I noticed that my x values can't go up to 10, so I'm going to switch that one to a -5, because -5 could be used. Okay, so let's see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and I am going to find those corresponding y values and then graph those. You try that now too. So one of the things I noticed is when I used 1, which is not a multiple of 5, remember multiples of the denominator mean things like 5, 10, 15, 20, or they're negative versions of those. Notice I got kind of an ugly decimal. It wasn't too bad, but it just is a little harder to graph those. So now I'm going to go ahead and I am going to create my points and then graph my line. So again, your graph should look the same as mine. I didn't use a straight edge, but it looks pretty good. So looking at this one, instead of writing an equation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create ordered pairs, which means points. I'm going to create 2 points based on what I have, and I'm going to graph those 2 points to create my line. And from that line, I can answer questions. So in this case, let's see, D, which is my downloads, is like my X value because the number of downloads, number of movies, would tell me what my cost is. C is going to be my Y value. So 4 movies for $12 means 4 movies, comma, $12 is going to be one of my points. 7 movies, $21 is going to be my second point. And on my piece of grid here, I'm going to try to see if I can squeeze that in here. I only have positive values, so I only need the first quadrant. So I went ahead, I made my points, and as I was graphing, you'll notice that I ran off the coordinate plane or the axes or the grid. And that's okay. I could have numbered by 2s instead, and that might have made it a little bit easier. But for the sake of what I'm doing and creating this line, that was good enough. So then I can use this information to try to estimate what my values would be. For example, if I was at 5. So if my values were at 5 movies, what based on my graph would I see as its corresponding cost? So at 5, if I come up here, I'm off a little bit, but it looks like it's about 14, and in fact, the answer is really 15, but 14 was a really close estimate based on my graph. If I wanted to, for example, guess with 3 and use my graph, again, I would go down to 3, which is right here, go up to the graph, try to find its corresponding point, which is about 8. Oh, that one's quite a bit off. And that's just because, sorry, I had to splice in there a bit. But in actuality, I've got a mistake here. In actuality, that value would be 9. So I'm, again, even though I guessed it was an 8, the 9 was really, really close. So here's one last challenge for you. We are going to solve the equation using algebra, using a table, and then using the graph. So I'm going to solve it using algebra first with my undo steps. Stop the video and try your undo steps. So I set up my equation and I used my undo steps. Remember, you're doing the opposite operation. I always combine my numbers, combine my variables, and then I divide by the coefficient of the x. And when I divide it by 1/4, 2 divided by 1/4, my answer is 8. So let's go ahead and let's try the same thing with the table. I'm going to use the same equation, which is 1/4 x minus 7 equals -5. I'm given various x values, and I'm just going to plug them in the equation and see which ones actually equal the -5. So, for example, I want to use -12. I'm going to do 1/4 times -12 minus 7 and find that value. Then I'm going to use 1/4 times negative 8 minus 7 and find that value and fill in the table. So stop the video and try that on your own. So I plugged those all into my equations. I used my calculator or I did the work longhand. And now I'm going to fill out my table. So when x was negative 10, my answer was, when x was negative 12, my answer was negative 10. And what's happening is I'm really looking at my y values and I'm trying to find for which x value when I plug in, so for which x value will I get a y that's equal to negative 5? And I notice that it happens to be 8, which is the same answer I got when I solved my equation. And the last way I'm going to look at this is I'm just going to go really, really close. Remember, we're looking where y is equal to negative 5. And when y is equal to negative 5, what is the corresponding x? Looks like I didn't quite have enough room on my table here, on my graph here. But if I was able to look at that, I would see that the corresponding x would be 8. So I can solve it using equations, solving equations, a table of values, and also a graph.